Chapter 18 of The King's Daughter. The King's Daughter by Pansy. Chapter 18. Signing the Pledge a Second Time. My son, give me thine heart, and let thine eyes observe my ways. Jim Forbes had taken even less pains than usual with his dress. His coat was out at both elbows, and very much frayed and soiled at the wrists, and he loafed along in a reckless fashion, as though he knew he was looking his worst and didn't care. His companion was fresh and dainty in a newly ironed blue and white muslin of delicate pattern, soft filmy laces at throat and wrists, and a spray of mignonette shedding faint perfume all about her. The conversation on her part was earnest; with him it partook of his general appearance, and seemed reckless. "When a fellow has give up, why, that's the end, and there's no more use of talking. I tried it, you know I did, and it was no kind of use, and now I'm just give up." "But, Mr. Forbes, I don't believe in any such doctrine, you know. I want you to try again. No one ever accomplished much with once trying." "Once!" he repeated fiercely. "I've tried 1,000 times. You don't know anything about it, Miss Bronson. No woman don't. I thought I'd rather cut my hand off than to break that pledge, and now I've gone and done it, and there's no use in talking." "Let's act, then, instead of talking," Dell said in her briskest tone. "You come right down to the temperance meeting with me, and sign the pledge over again. Then everybody will see that you are in earnest." Jim shook his head emphatically. "No, ma'am, I ain't a-going to do it. Whatever I be, I ain't the fellow to make promises and go back on 'em, and make 'em over again as easy as that. I don't go over all this trouble again for nobody." "Then," Dell said, with a weary sigh, "you will disappoint me sadly. I trusted you. I was not certain that you would get along without failures, because I know about the fearful temptations to which you are exposed, although you think I do not. You seem to forget where I live, and who my father is; but I felt confident that you would try again." Jim Forbes looked down at the sad young face with a sort of respectful curiosity in his gaze. "I'd not disappoint you if I could help it. I'd rather be hung than do it," he said at last, with a rough attempt at gallantry. "But you see how it is. I can't be anybody, and I ain't going to pretend I can." "Mr. Forbes, won't you try once more, to gratify me?" "And supposing I do, and fail again?" he said abruptly, a half determination expressed in his eye to do both, the trying and the failing immediately, and so afford proof of his inability to be anybody. "Why then," said Dell promptly, "I should want you to try again." Whereupon Jim laughed. His bitter spirit was not entirely proof against her fresh, brisk tones and words. "Besides," she said, eagerly, wanting to follow up her advantage, "it is such a wretched time now to desert the field, just when you are needed. Don't you know Sam Miller needs your help?" "My help!" snorted Jim, with his most scornful tone, all the bitterness returning. "Jolly help I'd be to any poor wretch. And whose help do you suppose I need to keep me straight, while I'm helping others?" "God's," said Dell, simply and reverently. To which he made no sort of answer. He had long ago ceased sneering at the name, at least in Dell's presence. They walked on a few steps in silence. Meantime, Mr. Tresevant and Miss Emmeline Elliott passed them, and Dell, intent on her work as she was, had time to notice the weary, pale look on the clergyman's face, and to indulge one sharp pang of pity over the desolation of both his life and hers, ere she turned again to Jim and asked her earnest question: "Won't you make another trial, rather than disappoint me, Mr. Forbes?" "I can't do it to night," he said doubtfully. "Why, Miss Bronson, you don't know the whole. You wouldn't want me to if you did. I," lowering his voice and his face turning very red, "I've been drinking, this very night, and all the fellows know it; and if I should go down there, anybody who stood near me would smell rum, and you see how that would look." "I know all about that," Dell said calmly. "I knew you had been drinking when I first met you. I knew you were on your way to drink more. Do you think people who have been drinking liquor ought not to go to a temperance meeting, or make up their minds to sign a pledge? I'm sure they are the very people I am after. As for the breath, I have my pocket half full of cloves. They will destroy the smell of whiskey. Mr. Forbes, will you go with me this evening?" "Yes," said Jim, with a sudden determination gleaming in his eye. "Yes, I will, I vum." They were very near the church now, and at the door Jim halted. "You go on in," he said gruffly. "I'll come pretty soon." And Dell, deciding that to be her wisest course, left him. A very respectable audience was gathering. As literary entertainments, the temperance meetings were growing in favor. Dell was at the wheezy organ, playing an interlude during the second song, when Tommy Truman made his way to her side, and began an eager story. "Jim Forbes was on the steps, but he would not come in. He has been drinking," Tommy whispered in low, shocked tones. "And he is ashamed. He says all the fellows know about it, and they are coming to night, and he can't." Meantime the organist prolonged the interlude, striking chords at random, and questioning the troubled little speaker. When she began to sing again, she skipped 2 verses, sang the last, then passed down the aisle out into the hall. Jim lounged in a miserable state of indecision and shamefacedness against the door. She went toward him immediately, speaking rapidly. "See how much you disarrange our program by your tardiness. I had to skip the opening song, and put the second one third, because I didn't want to sing it without your bass. Do come in now. It is nearly time for the next singing." "Miss Bronson, I can't. I vow I can't," said miserable Jim. "You don't know how I feel, and all the fellows are coming. It's no use talking." Dell turned and looked full in his face with great solemn eyes, and with unutterable amazement in her voice. "Why, Mr. Forbes, you promised." He returned the look, his very hair seeming to grow redder, and at last he muttered, "So I did, I vum. Well, Miss Bronson, I'll come," which he presently did, looking flushed and uncomfortable. Mr. Tresevant, notwithstanding his settled and unwavering objections to the temperance pledge, seemed inclined to haunt the temperance meetings. He and Miss Emmeline Elliott were together this evening, and Dell wished at least one of them elsewhere. When at the close of the literary exercises Mr. Nelson asked for the forgiveness and reinstatement of one of their number who had broken his pledge, but was again among them, repentant and ready to try again, and when, after the pardon of the society was unanimously granted, poor Jim stumbled forward, summoning greater courage for his awful passage from his seat to the pledge table than he would have required to face the cannon's mouth, Miss Emmeline giggled, and whispered to her companion loud enough for both Jim and Dell to hear. "Here comes Miss Bronson's protégé again. Do you suppose they have him sign every time for effect, you know?" But Mr. Tresevant made some inaudible reply, and looked very pale and very grave. He had not reached the point where he could ridicule anything in the remotest degree connected with Miss Bronson. As for Jim, he drew himself up with fierce, angry eyes, and had nearly laid down the pen, when Dell, bending forward from her seat by the organ, murmured low, "I thank you very much, Mr. Forbes," and instantly the pen was grasped again, and the crossed-out name was renewed. "I think it is very remarkable that you succeeded in prevailing upon that poor fellow to come to night," Mr. Nelson said, as he and Dell walked homeward, after the meeting was closed. "Do you know he utterly and emphatically refused me to day, though I presented every argument and inducement in my power?" But Dell was sad. She did not feel encouraged or hopeful. It was well to bear a hopeful face before poor Jim, if she could, but in truth her heart was heavy. "I don't know that it will be of any use," she said, wearily. "He will probably break his pledge again, and be in a worse state than before. I confess I have very little hope of him." Mr. Nelson eyed her searchingly. "Are you going to desert your colors and lose faith in the pledge at this late day?" he asked her, playfully. "No, I am not, by any means," she said, roused and excited. "I have all the faith in it that I ever had, and mean to work for it just as faithfully. But I never believed it could work miracles, and it seems to me there is almost a miracle needed in his case. His education, you know, has not been such as to make even a solemn promise very binding, and his temptations are many and peculiar. I think the pledge is better calculated to keep earnest-minded young men, those who have conscientious natures. I cannot help thinking that there is but one hope for poor Jim. If he had the strong arm to lean upon, then his pledge would be kept. But, unfortunately, those weak natures are the very last to submit themselves to Christ, so that really I am as hopeless in regard to that as I am about the other." "Do you think weak natures are less likely to be religious than stronger ones?" "Much less. Don't you think weak people are obstinate people? I think they nearly always have a mistaken idea of their own strength, while a really strong nature is always conscious of how little his strength amounts to after all, and what infinite resources out of and above himself he needs to sustain him. "It is a new idea," he said musingly, "but I am not sure that it is not a true one. I don't know which people you class me among, the weak or the strong," he added laughing, "but I certainly have a very modest and limited idea of my own power of accomplishing anything." "I class you among the people who are doing violence to their own consciences, Mr. Nelson. I hope you will forgive me for speaking thus plainly, but I do not understand you. I do not see how you can reconcile it with your nature to live only half a life." "I do not understand myself," he said, sighing a little. "I sometimes feel greatly disheartened about it all. But, Miss Dell, if I had your strong arm that you speak of to lean upon, I do not think I would descend into the valley of gloom as you and I seem to have done this evening." "Then why in the world haven't you it?" she asked him quickly. "You seem to have a realizing sense of the power that it ought to exert over your life. You see very distinctly wherein I fail, when my weak foolish heart gets the better of my sense and my faith. Why don't you set me a better example?" He laughed a little at finding his reproof so suddenly turned upon himself, but seeing that she waited for an answer, presently said, "Perhaps I haven't your confidence in the ability of the strong arm." "Oh, yes, you have, Mr. Nelson. I think you believe in Christ just as entirely as I do; the intellectual belief, I mean. The only difference between us is, that you do not choose to accept him as your personal helper." "But, Miss Dell, don't you see what an inconsistent being you make me appear? Wherein would be the consistency of such a belief?" "I certainly do not know, Mr. Nelson. Won't you please try to discover wherein it lies?" And as she said this, Dell mounted the steps of her own home. CHAPTER XIX.